This is Polyamory Weekly, episode 32 for November 1st, 2005. Coming up on this week's show, poly living, poly dating, those crazy Mormons, poly conferences, poly in the media, a poly sponsor, and communication wisdom. It's all about poly today. That's all coming up on this week's show. Well, hello everyone. Welcome to episode 32 of Polyamory Weekly. For our under 18 listeners, this is an adult-oriented podcast about really lascivious things like communication and honesty in relationships. If you're under 18 and looking for upfront advice and answers to questions about sex, please visit www.scarletteen.com. For everyone else, hello and welcome. I am Minx, your host, without great answer this week, sadly. And we have such a mishmash of topics today. It's going to be really fun. I'm going to feel like a DJ playing like little clips and bouncing from topic to topic. But first of all, this is Polyamory Weekly, tales from the front of responsible non-monogamy from a pansexual, kink-friendly point of view. And if you have questions, comments, or feedback, please email me, cunningminx, CUNNINGMINX, @gmail.com. And attach, if you like, an audio file, as one listener did this week. Thank you so much. Or you can always just call the listener comment line at area code 206-600-5677. Leave a comment there, and I'd be happy to play it on the show. And the first thing I have to say, being in Chicago at this time, I have to say, yay, go White Sox. Who ever thought that a team from Chicago would win the World Series? Now, I'm a little disappointed it's not the Cubs, but hey, I mean, it's not like Armageddon is coming today. So that would be the case if the Cubs actually won the World Series. But I was really happy for the White Sox and was really thrilled that they threw an old-fashioned ticker tape parade down LaSalle Street, which was really pretty darn exciting, even though I only got to see it on TV. This doesn't happen every single day in Chicago. In fact, I found out the last time it happened was in 1985 when the Bulls won a championship or something. So that was pretty exciting to me, and I'm not even really a sports fan. But anyway, on to poly topics. First of all, I'm so excited to start out with this. Polyamory Weekly has its very first sponsor. And so I'm just going to play the sponsorship bit for you.
Hey there, this is Caius, webmaster of the Polyamorous Percolations online community, available at polyamory.lucerella.com. It's our goal to provide a place for folks in the polyamory community to share their thoughts and experiences with others. We feature original articles, interviews, and an extensive collection of polyamory resources for you to explore. Our online user forums provide a place to discuss issues that go far beyond the usual email digests that can pile up in your inbox and seem overwhelming. In our forums, you choose which topics you want to read or respond to. Why not log on to polyamory.lucerella.com today and see for yourself. That's polyamory.lucerella.com.
So a special thanks to Chias for putting in our very first sponsorship. So Polyamory Weekly is now $25 richer, which means that is one full tank of gas. I get really good gas mileage on my car. That's a full tank of gas towards sending Minx and possibly Great Answer to do a live Poly Weekly at a polyamory conference coming up next year. And we do have a couple of conferences to mention later on in the show. So I'm very excited. Again, if you'd like to sponsor an episode, $25, just email me, cunningminx@gmail.com, and the money goes to conference expenses for presenting various seminars and doing live podcasts from polyamory conferences. Okay, enough about that. We have so much listener mail on so many really great topics. First of all, Mark wrote in with a question about poly living. We brought up this issue last week, and nobody really wrote in with advice. So those of you who are in poly living situations, if you have any words of wisdom about people about to move in with a threesome or a V, anything you've learned along the way, please email us so that I can read them on the air, because I don't have a lot of words of wisdom for people in that situation. So he wrote in and said, what sorts of things do you hear in regards to territory in live-in relationships? It seems to me that men and women have different sorts of living areas and household roles which are important to them. What happens when two SOs in the same household clash on territorial issues? How do you even recognize that it is a territory issue? The last bit comes from an old posting on the big poly list. A woman had written in to say that her SO and his new sweetie had left her a note about having made a big dinner and going out to catch a movie. She found herself in a blur of jealousy, but couldn't figure out why. She knew they were planning on hanging out that night, etc. It was only later that she figured out that she was upset because they had been using her kitchen without her around. It had never happened before, so no one realized that it might be a point of contention. Well, Mark, I'm so glad you wrote in, because that is an excellent, excellent point. That, in addition to just figuring out like the rent and the bills and the arrangements and, sleepovers, one of the reasons that I personally am not particularly interested in sharing living space is that I am very territorial. I know it's hard to believe with my having a podcast and all, but I'm actually very private about my personal space. And while I love to give parties, and invite people over, I think I'm a pretty good host and all, but I do really like having my own space. And I'd be willing to share certain amounts of my space, but I can see myself getting really upset about something like that, about like using my kitchen, because a lot of people are very territorial about the kitchen. For a lot of people, that's where they create. It's a space where they go to work and meditate, and it's a very private space. I've always been very uncomfortable even just offering to do dishes in other people's kitchens, because I kind of feel like I'm not going to do it the way they want. It's their kitchen. I remember my mom getting really, really upset when my grandmother came in and did the dishes in her kitchen, because she was touching stuff in her kitchen. So I can really see that being an issue. However, communicate about it, blah, 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 all of that. But I've got to say, though, that I've had these same types of issues in monogamous relationships when you're living with someone, and I think the same type of thing applies, that this could just as easily have been a wife or girlfriend, and the husband left a message that he, cooked in the kitchen with his buddy or with a friend of his, and she got upset. So, how would you deal with that situation if it were, just a regular, live-in guy, regular, listen to me. If it were in a monogamous, let's say, situation, how would you deal with that? I think it's perfectly normal to be possessive about certain pieces of furniture, certain rooms of the house. Just, know what your hard limits are. And actually, I love that Mark writes that it took her a while to figure it out, but she, did the work. She sat there and said, why am I feeling this way? What is it? Figured out that it was jealousy about the kitchen. And then once you know that, you talk about what the hard limits are. Definitely don't, and then of course there's all the gray area in between. And I would guess it probably took a few other instances before they finally figured out what she was comfortable with and what other people were comfortable with living in the house. Well, they're still using the most utilitarian room of the house. Obviously you have to be able to use the kitchen, but also to work out her personal comfort level with a space that she saw as being very, very personal. Enough rambling about the space. Obviously just talk about it. Just be aware that this issue may come up. If anyone has had these issues and had any tricks or tips that you use to deal with having personal space in a communal living situation, please email me and let me know. We'll read it on the show. John Bear wrote in a little bit more about Heinlein. It's hard to have a poly family or relationship or even swinging in a small town without everyone knowing about it. And our view of poly family is mostly from the only example we both have, Heinlein. So he writes on about it, and I know a lot of people, their first experience or their first exposure, their first model paradigm, if you will, of communal poly living was Heinlein. And we're not going to talk about Heinlein on the show. It's just too controversial. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But I think it also helps. One of the reasons we do Poly Weekly is because it helps to see several different models of poly living, several different poly living arrangements and configurations, so that you can figure out what's absolutely best for you and for your relationship. There's not just the one model. There are thousands and bazillions of models. Anyway. I'm so glad that my buddy Instant Expert wrote in, "Hi, Instant Expert, how are you?" And he said, "I take some exception to," this was about the comment on turning down poly advances and how you deal with rejecting dating possibilities when you're poly. And he said, "I take some exception to Eldon Blackthorne's statement that you treat turning down poly advances the same as you do mono advances." And I'm going to stop and insert here. That was not his statement, that was mine. He went on his audio show amusing about how do you turn people down. My comment was, well, hey, why not just treat it the same you would a mono person? So that was me, not him, me editorializing. And Instant Expert continues, "I'd find this to be true if polyamorous were the majority. Certainly it's valid if you're poly rejecting the advance of a mono person because the same dynamics apply. However, in poly, as well as the BDSM world, the population is much smaller. Sometimes it becomes tricky to turn someone down without hurting feelings, especially when you have a close-knit group of friends. If you outright reject someone, what will that do to your otherwise happy group dynamic? What if you reject someone in your close circle of friends but want to pursue something with another member of that group? How will the first person feel? They'll probably feel worse, even though they were okay with being turned down initially. Just my 2 cents. Well, actually, I think, Instant Expert, I think that's a lot more than 2 cents. I mean, you bring up a really good point. Although I'm still going to argue that I don't think this is specific to poly or BDSM. I know a lot of monogamous people who have the same situation. They're in a close-knit group of friends, and a lot of people are afraid to ask somebody out because they're afraid they will do that very thing, that they will ruin the group dynamic and that they'll ruin their friendship with that particular person, especially if they have a tight-knit group of friends, that if you ask someone out within the group and the person says no, or he or she isn't interested, then somehow that's going to change the group dynamic. And you know what? I think in both situations, whether it be poly or just a regular monogamy, that's a valid concern. I mean, an expression of interest and taking that risk, of course, it is going to change the group dynamic. It's probably not going to change it a whole lot. And there probably are going to be some feelings that arise. But I would tend to think that most of us adults it might hurt for a while to get some rejection. It might kind of funk up the group dynamic for a little bit. But I can't think that simply one person asking another person out and the person saying, no, I'm not interested, is really going to permanently, substantially screw up a group dynamic. I think it might throw it off. It'll change it for a little bit. But I don't think it's just a date, for God's sake. I mean, I certainly understand that it would make things a little wonky for a little bit, but, I think with adults, if you can just sort of talk this over and say very politely, I think you're a great person, I just don't happen to be interested in you that way. And yeah, you're right. I mean, of course it's going to hurt that person if you then go ask out somebody else in the close-knit group, but we're adults. We'll flap about it for a little bit, and especially if you talk to the original person, if you feel it's necessary, and say, hey, I'm really sorry, I'm not particularly interested in you. I am interested in somebody else, and I am going to pursue that, just so you know. Or, not, as it may not be appropriate. But I tend to, we're adults, we're going to get over this stuff. We've been turned down before. It sucks. We hurt for a little bit. And we may grouse for a little bit. Oh my God, he I asked him out and he said no, but then he turned around and asked this other person out and she's not nearly as good as me. No. Yeah, we'll do that for a little bit and then we'll get over it. It is a risk. I guess I'm agreeing with you, Instant Expert. Yeah, of course it's a risk. And the risk is changing the group dynamic and maybe hurting a few feelings. But, we are grown-ups. We can communicate and we will eventually get over it. Next letter, next topic. Cayman wrote in on Mormon polygamy. How is this for skipping around to different topics? He said, I found it interesting that you would be discussing polygamy and was surprised to find that Great Answer was raised LDS. That's Latter-day Saints, I believe. I was also raised LDS and still live in Utah. Unfortunately, Great Answer is incorrect, as he alluded he might be when it comes to LDS polygamy. I was given the same BS explanation when growing up. Polygamy was not instituted to take care of widowed women. Polygamy was officially instituted in Nauvoo, Illinois, although very, very quietly, by Joseph Smith before the mass exodus to Utah. Parentheses, also, the wine that Jesus drank in Jerusalem was not just grape juice and did contain alcohol. Another wonderful story told to Mormon children. Close parentheses. I would recommend to Great Answer or anyone curious about the early history of the LDS Church from a non-official perspective to read Fawn M. Brody's No Man Knows My History. And by the way, I'll find that on Amazon and put a link to it in the show notes at www.livejournal.com/users/Polly Weekly. He continues, Miss Brody was a relative of LDS President David O. McKay, who had unfettered access to church documents that no other author ever has. Ooh, sounds juicy, doesn't it? Another book that deals with polygamy and religious fundamentalism within the LDS Church is a book called Under the Banner of Heaven. It's a bit gruesome as it centers around the story of a vicious, religiously motivated murder, but it does contain a lot of information regarding the modern version of polygamy in centers such as Colorado City, Arizona, and Hildale, Utah. Interestingly, the leader of the sect from Colorado City, Arizona, is currently on the FBI's most wanted list. That's not controversial at all. Actually, thanks so much to Cayman for writing in with those resources. I'm so glad we have listeners who can correct the information that we are given. Next topic, Brent wrote in again regarding Dr. Ruth, and he says, I think you guys should cut Dr. Ruth some slack. Remember, this is in reference to last week's discussion of Dr. Ruth saying that there is no such thing as a bisexual. And he says, I think you should cut Dr. Ruth some slack. I mean, she's 127 years old, by golly. She's not old enough to remember life when we were all sexual and not young enough to be in touch with the realities of sexuality of the under 40 set. Besides, who listens to Dr. Ruth anymore anyway? Well, she is still, I mean, the reason I read it, I just thought it was interesting that there are sexual experts who are still saying things like that. My God. And I'm more of a, what's her name? Sue Johansson. She's on, she's on Oxygen and I think some other station, and it's Talk Sex with Sue Johansson or something like that. And she's like in her 60s or 70s. She's this old lady. But she's like, but she talks, very frankly about sex. She brings sex toys and vibrators on the show. She talks very openly and honestly about STDs and, anal sex and bisexuality. And it's really great to see this sort of grandmotherly woman talking to you as you would expect, a 20 or 30-year-old to. So that's just my little plug for her. And there was also a short email from Brody who said, he said, thank you for reminding me of a very dear childhood memory. When I was a kid, my mother would call the local radio station, have them dedicate a song to me on my birthday. It was always chuffed to bits. Chuffed to bits. Wait. And I was always chuffed to bits to hear my name over the radio. I don't know what that means. I'm reading this. I skimmed over it before. I don't know what chuffed to bits means, but I kind of like it. Hearing you say my name on your show reminded me of that. And he also paid many compliments and gave thoughts on the interview with Men of Sin, which we're getting so many interesting emails about that. There's not enough time to read them all. But yeah, a lot of really interesting thoughts on religion. Oh, and a continuation of Cayman's comment from before. He says, No Man Knows My History covers the exact same events as the official church history, but from an outside point of view. Most LDS people are aggressively negative about both books, but the books are actually surprisingly sympathetic to the LDS persecution that occurred in Kirkland, Missouri, and Nauvoo. It's probably only surprising to this Mormon-grown boy who was told that any such books are nothing but smear campaigns against the LDS faith. Okay, and I think finally in our big old honkin' mailbag this week, we'll tie up with an audio comment. Yay, I love audio comments. It's not just me. Brian wrote in with his audio comment on Polly and the media and how long Polly has actually been around.
Hello, Minx. I've been listening to Polly Weekly for some time now when I'm driving around for work, and I'm almost disappointed that I have no more of your archive material to work through. Recently, you had a show talking about Polly and the media, and there's a sense I'm getting from some of the articles that I'm reading on it. It seems as though many folks are thinking that being Polly is something new, and that brought a story to mind for me. When I was a kid, I spent a lot of time with my grandparents, and they had these two special friends that they spent a lot of time with. Their names were Ed and Maxine. It was not uncommon for me to see my grandfather alone with Maxine, and my grandmother alone with Ed. It was something of a scandal in our small Kansas town, and my mother just about had a fit whenever she saw them together. She told me that they were these horrible people, and she actually whispered the word swingers. She went on at length about how she could not understand how they could split their love up like that. At that time, I spent a lot of time with my grandfather, and at least one weekend a month we went fishing. It was a great treat for me to get away from my brother and spend some time alone with him. Once, after my mother had had one of her conniptions about their situation, I asked him if he didn't love my grandmother enough, and if that was why he had to spend time with Maxine. Now, my grandfather, who was not a very nice man, he was one of the biggest bigots on the face of the earth, actually said something that I have come to think of as kind of profound. He told me, "You can't split love. You can't divide it between people. You can only grow it and multiply it." Being a kid at the time, I just couldn't leave it alone, and I had to ask him why. He said, "Sometimes we just have too much love inside of us, and we need to share it." Now, despite my mother's rantings about her immoral parents and their swinging lifestyle, but here's your stroke, Minx. After listening to your podcasts, I realized they weren't swingers at all. They were poly. These were 4 adults who had a committed relationship that lasted almost 4 decades. When we start thinking about the families we choose, what more could we ask for than a relationship that is that enduring? Anyway, I just thought it was kind of interesting to think about people who were living the kind of relationships that many of us are striving toward in our own lives, but doing it in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s. Keep up the good work, Minx, because hey, we're listening.
Thanks so much to Brian for sending that in. That's a really great point. I think we're finally, one of the reasons I'm fascinated by the whole phenomenon of poly in the media is because it does seem to just now be hitting the mainstream media. But, as he told in his story, it's been around for a long time. It's been around, in previous generations and for hundreds and thousands of years. Polyamory has been around. It's just talked about a little bit more now. All these sensationalist articles that are written about, oh, is monogamy out of date? Oh, is monogamy out of style? Well, this has always been a choice. This has always been an option. It's always been a lifestyle. It just hasn't always been talked about in the mass media quite as much as it is today. And isn't that a fabulous segue into our next segment on poly in the media? Now, this is a reference to Michael Baisden's radio show. It was on Thursday, the 27th of October, and it is Kiss FM out of New York. And I saw on the Polyamory channel on LiveJournal that he has a series of radio shows on polyamory. Haven't had a chance to listen to all of them, but his show is called Love, Lust, Lies, and I guess it's all about love, sex, relationships, except he's a little raunchier and he talks even faster than me, if you can believe that. But, well, here's a little segment from the introduction to the first show.
Hey, it's truly radio for open-minded grown folks. That's right, we're talking about the 4 most controversial topics in the world. Monogamy. That's right, I said it. We're talking about monogamy, or should I say, the myth of monogamy. Now, before we get started, let me warn all the super church folks. That's right, I call them super church folks. You may get a little offended by the show today. The message board is already blowing up with folks quoting the Bible.
And I did download these. I will provide links to the files and links to the downloads in the show notes section. But I thought it was interesting. At first I was like, oh, great, this is going to be one of those, stupid, freaky things. Because he kept saying, oh, is it freaky? Do you want to get your groove on with more than one person? But then he also brings up the idea of, if you can love 2 kids, if you can love 2 friends, why can't you love and be committed to 2 people? And this really made me perk up. I'm like, wait a second. That's what people who get it say. So, and, he had various people call in and say what they thought. And it's my understanding that he's going to be interviewing Robin Trask and some other people. So I'll provide the links to these and listen to them. And if you guys get a chance to listen to them, email me your comments and feedback and tell me what you think. And you may have noticed that we've been having some more kind of technical topics lately, poly in the media, poly in religion. You notice we haven't really talked a lot about communication and argument styles and things like that. Well, there's a reason for that. Great Answer and Genevieve and I have been going through some really tough times in our poly family, and I was just really sick of talking about communication and argument, and I was really tired of communicating and arguing, so I've sort of avoided those topics for a little bit. However, a friend of mine wrote some wonderful bits of wisdom on her live journal regarding communication and argument wisdom that I really had to share. And this is from, I'm going to call her Kay. And she says, every once in a while, I post a collection of random thoughts and musings. Rambling in this way gets them out of my head and lets other people listen to the voices for a while. And she just does a series of bullet points. First one, it takes at least two people to create a misunderstanding. And I've yet to see a situation where one was right and one was wrong. The truth is always somewhere in the middle. The truth is always somewhere in the middle. And Kay, I have to say, this sounds like the simplest bit of logic, but it's so true. It reminds me of when I used to do customer claims or claims adjuster training for Allstate. And in this particular state, in Illinois, they're what they call a, what is it called? Shared fault, something like that. Anyway, it's not that in an accident, one driver is completely at fault and the other driver is completely blameless. What they do is they look at what happened and they assign a percentage of blame to each person. As in, you were making a right turn and you could have looked, but you didn't. However, this other person ran a red light. So therefore, you are 20% to blame and the other person's 80% to blame. And it was really fascinating, like how they worked out, the different percentages of blame. And for the most part, I thought they were reasonably fair. And I thought it was a great way of looking at things, not, I'm who's right and who's wrong, but we all could have done something a little bit differently. How should we look at this? And I think you're right. The truth is always somewhere in the middle. That sure, maybe your partner is 95% wrong, but it does take two people to create a misunderstanding. And the willingness to share the blame, the willingness to look at yourself and say, okay, I'm sorry, here's what I did wrong, and here's what I could have done differently, makes it so much easier for your partner to then come out and say, okay, all right, you're right, here's what I did wrong, and here's what I could have done differently. Anyway, I continue with her writing. It takes a lot of internal cojones and a certain amount of practice skill to own up to the places where you are wrong without casting blame, requiring an apology, or turning things into a situation where you are expecting a quid pro quo. Personally, I'm still working on that one. You are not the center of the universe, no matter how much you would like to be. I had to email her and say, what? I'm not? Surely you're wrong about this. She continues, if a person is overly egocentric, and usually a good deal of insecurity comes along with this, they will likely see people's actions and words as far more directed at them than those actions and words really are. Not all whispering and giggling on the other side of the classroom is about you. And again, I say, yes, it is. Everything's about me. If a person is not egocentric enough, they often become a doormat. It's really hard to determine where the line is between being not a doormat and being overly defensive. The law of abundance does hold true, but it will not hold true if we are unwilling to change our situations and our attitudes enough to allow it to exist in our lives. That one's a thinker for me. And I have issues with the law of abundance too. It's one of those, I agree in theory, but when it comes down to practice, I have a lot of difficulty reaching out in my life. But that's a topic for another show. She continues, being broke is a temporary situation. Poverty is a state of mind. Don't blame me for this one. I heard it on NPR a few weeks ago and it stuck with me. Stone walls do not a prison make, nor iron bars a cage. Sometimes you are wrong. Learn to deal with it, own up to it, and learn from it. It doesn't matter that the other guy was wrong too. Amen to this. We all share. We all make mistakes. How we handle the hard times speaks far more about our character than how we handle the easy times, and not everyone is going to agree on exactly what that speaking is. Growing up doesn't mean forgetting how to play or to take a child's joy in the universe. It does, however, mean learning to deal with loss, defeat, chaos, acts of nature and God, meanies, and other random events while remaining centered and with a certain amount of aplomb. Okay, if I could learn how to do this, that would be great. Some things I can be balanced about, some things I can take in stride, and some things just make me fall apart, and it's really embarrassing when they do. when you're right. It's just loss, defeat, chaos, acts of nature, or a big fat meanie. Someone being insensitive. And finally, the last one I'll read, cats are among the most determined, narcissistic animals I've ever met. There's a bit of wisdom for you, like we didn't know that. And they can lick their own butts. Anyway, that was my little editorial comment, by the way. Kay was not nearly that crude. And finally, have a lot of really great announcements. First of all, wanted to give props again to our very first Polyamory Weekly sponsor. Yay, I'm so excited. Go visit the website, polyamory.lucerella, Lucerella.com. Tell him Mink sent ya. His site is also, by the way, not for profit. He's doing it as a community resource just like me, so it was very kind of him to actually do a sponsorship for me when really, he could use a sponsorship himself. But hey, we're all in this together. Okay, a couple of poly conferences coming up I wanted to mention. First of all, I got an email from Manelqua, Mary, and Christy. I'm so sure I pronounced that name wrong. Hello, my two wives and I are the founders and resident caretakers of a 175-acre sanctuary in southern Indiana named Our Haven, available at www.ourhaven.info, info. We're hosting the Heartland Polyamory Conference May 26th through 29th, 2006, and info at www.heartlandpoly.com. I would like to know if there's any way we can get our information on Poly Weekly. Well, sure you can. And yes, I am going to be submitting topics for seminars at the Heartland Poly Conference because it's not that far from where I am, and 175-acre sanctuary, doesn't that sound fun? Anyway, so check out those websites if you're in the Midwest or if you'd like to travel to the Midwest for that conference. Also, just found out about a poly conference in Europe. There is a conference on polyamory and mononormativity on the 4th, 5th, and 6th of November, so that's coming up this weekend. It is an English language conference at the University of Hamburg, Germany, next weekend, titled International Conference on Polyamory and Mononormativity. And I will provide a link to the full program, because it's very long, on the show notes at www.livejournal.com/users/polyweekly. But there are topics like rules and regulations, how consensual non-monogamous relationships negotiate love, commitment and sexual intimacy, polyamory and its others, on the representation of casual sex swinging and promiscuity in polyamory discourses, polyamory among Catholic educated lesbians. I mean, how specific is that? Rewriting the lexicon of love in mononormative culture. This sounds like incredibly intellectual polyamory, and I really, really, really want to go. We'll have to just keep those sponsorships up so eventually I can go to some of these like intellectual poly conferences in Europe. And, oh, by the way, it does end with a workshop on jealousy by Dossie Easton. Yay, love her. And also found out about a conference in Durban, South Africa. It's not a conference, I'm sorry. Durban, South Africa. It's a November polyamory lunch. It is the Durban Polyamory November discussion meeting, Saturday the 5th of November. That's this weekend, 1 o'clock p.m. at the Kathmandu Restaurant, 411 Windermere Road, Morningside. And they say they just meet once a month to eat good food, talk to other poly people. Yeah, I do just read these announcements to make it sound like we're more international. I was just excited that there's a South Africa polyamory lunch. Isn't that cool? And finally, I also wanted to mention the Poly Living conferences. There is Poly Living 2006 from February 3rd to 5th in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And also the Poly at Sea Fall 2006, and that's the very first poly cruise offered by Poly Living. Doesn't that sound fun? And these are available at www.polyliving.com/conferences/eventintro.html. Oh, and one more. And Australian Adam was kind enough to look up some poly resources for us because I think I mentioned on the last show that we have like 3 listeners in Australia. Actually, I don't know where our listener base is because the stats don't really tell me that. So it's just on who writes in. But he said, listening to Poly Weekly 31, heard your listener mail from another Australian, thought you might want to pass on these Aussie resources. The Poly Oz, that's POLYOZ website, is at http://polyoz. You know what? It's way too long. I'll put it in the show notes. We're really professional here at Polyamory Weekly. But there's a Polyoz website and a Polyoz Yahoo group. And also Perth Polyamory is at Vama, V-A-M-A, at iinet.net.au. Speaking from a personal perspective, he continues, I have found Australia to be a very kink-friendly country, but more about that another time. Ooh, kinky Australians, woohoo! And so I emailed him back and said, you're from Australia, and you didn't even bother to do an audio comment so that I could hear the sexy Australian accent, but then I see he wrote a PS saying, looking into getting a USB microphone. So anybody with cool and exotic accents, hey, Australian, if you're in Europe, you have one of those cool exotic accents, send me an audio comment. I think that would be really cool. Anyway, I will have links to all those Australia resources on the show notes. And how was this first show? Did we just bounce around to enough different topics? I mean, we covered a little bit of poly living arrangements, on rejection and poly dating. We talked about Mormons and a million conferences, poly in like a radio show in New York. We got a sponsor. We got communication. We talked about cats. We just cover everything here. Anyway, thanks so much, guys, for listening to me ramble for yet another half hour. I really enjoy my time with you guys. Questions, comments, or feedbacks, email me, cunningminx, CUNNINGMINX, @gmail.com, or call the listener comment line, area code 206-600-5677. So I'm really excited. We have some really great interviews coming up. Not just Susan Wright with the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom is going to be talking to us about the FBI porn squad. Please. But also with Sean Wright, who is the author of 2 for 1, which is a poly-friendly novel that I am about halfway through and very much enjoying. And also Stephen Elliott. If you recall, Stephen Elliott is the author of the short story in the New York Times, 3 Men and a Woman, that I referred to a couple episodes back. And it turns out we had a lovely phone conversation. He's very much into BDSM, recently started seeing a poly woman, and is going to share his BDSM and poly viewpoints with us later this week and on an upcoming show. So how's that for exciting interview teasers? Ooh, stay tuned. Keep your podcatcher pointed at Polyamory Weekly. Okay, all right. Anyway, thanks so much for listening, guys. Welcome to our new listeners, by the way. And if you're from anywhere other than the States, hey, give me a shout out. Let me know where you're from. I'm curious. All right, thanks for listening, guys. And remember, it's all about the love.